Okay, hi class. This is lecture 2, part 3. Carbon. So this corresponds to the Campbell Biology textbook, chapter 4. And if you're using the OpenStax textbook, this is chapter 2, section 3. So carbon in general is a really important molecule in biology. And if you are a biology major, you're probably going to have to take organic chemistry at some point. It's super challenging, but it's worth it for a lot of reasons, as we'll cover a little bit in this part of the lecture. So organic chemistry is the study of compounds that contain carbon regardless of origin. So there's like organic food or whatever. So organic chemistry is the study of compounds that contain carbon, and organic compounds can range from simple molecules to really big ones. So as mentioned in the first part, so the overall percentages of the major elements of life, it's a lot of carbon, number one, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphate. They're all quite uniform from one organism to another, so like the ratio of each of these is pretty consistent in different organisms. And it's for a reason. The way that these molecules, these atoms can form different molecules is really important to life. So just like water is important, so is carbon. And so because carbon can form 4 bonds, it's awesome. It can work with a whole bunch of different other players. And so carbon can make all kinds of different organic molecules. So the great diversity of organisms on the planet is due to the versatility of carbon. So again, it's kind of just like lucky that carbon happens to have the bonding capabilities that it does, and that's why it's so important to life. And it's because of carbon's electron configuration. So if you remember the valence electrons, I'll show a picture on the next slide, but it's because of carbon's electron configuration that helps that atom interact with so many different things. So yeah, just remember that electron configuration determines the kinds of bonds and the number of bonds that an atom can form with other atoms. So remember that, And so for carbon specifically, carbon has 4 valence electrons. So remember, the first shell can only hold 2 electrons, the next shell can hold up to 8, but carbon only happens to have 4 valence electrons there. So it has 4 open spots, as kind of shown in this figure. So it kind of can bond and wants to bond with up to 4 different atoms because it wants to fill its electron valence shell. So this enables carbon to form large, complex molecules. It's like if there was like the basic Lego, because that Lego can join with so many other different things. That's why it's like the basic all-purpose Lego, right? Specialized pieces that can only fit with one other thing aren't going to be as versatile as like carbon. So in molecules that have multiple carbons, each carbon bonded to 4 other atoms has what's called a tetrahedron. So in these figures, the black sphere is a carbon. And I'm pretty sure these are hydrogens, just as an example of something that carbon can bond to. So if it bonds to 1, 2, 3, 4 other things, 4 hydrogens, then it'll form this kind of shape just because of the physics of like how the electrons poke out. Yeah, I'll leave the specialized language for chemistry. So yeah, the physics basically of like how the electrons poke out and how things are going to line up when they get bonded. So a carbon and multiple things, it's going to form this shape called a tetrahedron. In molecules with multiple carbons, they're going to form tetrahedrons still. So they'll be arranged like that. Like this tetrahedron will be facing that one, and this one will be facing this one. When two carbon atoms are joined by a double bond, this changes that like shape that it's gonna be able to make. So it'll just be like flat. It'll be all on the same plane. You don't necessarily have to know all this detail, but just to kind of show you that like shape of molecule can be different. So yeah, sometimes if it's going to be together with a single bond, it'll kind of form this kind of shape. If there's a double bond, it'll make it more flat. So the number of unpaired electrons in general, as a reminder, in the valence shell is called its valence. So if there's, 4 unpaired electrons, then it has a valence of 4. That's the number of covalent bonds it can form. So the electron configuration of carbon gives it covalent compatibility with many different elements. The most frequent bonding partners of carbon, carbon can bind to other carbons, but they can also bond to hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And that's because they happen to also have valence electrons. And so they kind of want to bond together. So carbon atoms can partner with atoms other than hydrogen. We showed hydrogen as like a simple example. But they can bond with other stuff too, like oxygen. So in carbon dioxide, CO2 that we breathe out, here's a carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms. And so they come together to fill their electron valence shells. And so this ends up completing that valence shell for each of these atoms in this molecule. So this oxygen now has 2, 4, 6, 8, and it's happy. The carbon now has 2, 4, 6, 8, and it's happy. And then now the oxygen has 2, 4, 6, 8, and so it's happy. So by bonding all together, they fulfill their valence electron shells. But carbon can also link to other carbon atoms. So this is just kind of like a linear chain of 3 carbons and 6 hydrogens. Yeah, because especially in organic chemistry, if you take it, you're going to be talking about molecules that are big. And so we can't always draw out these figures. We can draw these, and then sometimes even more simply, we can just draw like lines in organic chemistry, and each point of the line is a carbon or represents a carbon. So, for example, like here, these rings, you could draw out every single carbon and bond and hydrogen, but especially in organic chemistry where you're just focusing on carbon-based molecules, we can do this kind of drawing where it's just a shape, but it's implied that each point at the end of this line is a carbon, and that there's also the maximum number of hydrogens. So there would be 2 hydrogens here, and then 2 here, and 2 here. But again, that's a problem for chemistry. But just to show you. So yeah, carbon atoms can be linked into chains, into rings, into all kinds of forms. And so these are the big bonding partners of carbon. As a reminder, here's the carbon one at the end. Carbon can bond to itself, but it can also bond to these other things. And especially because they happen to also want to fill their valence shells. So that's why they're such common bonding partners. They're buddies. They both want to fulfill their valence electrons and shells, and they're besties. So yeah, carbon chains, one linked to another, help form the skeletons of most organic molecules. And carbon chains can vary in the length, how long, how many carbons are in this chain, and also the shape. So carbons can be as little as like just one carbon. You can add another one that's a different molecule, add another one, it's also a different molecule. And they can be long chains. So they can vary in the length and then also the shape because of, again, how the double bonds versus single bonds might change that like configuration of a molecule. That'll change the shape, where the bonds are. If they branch out. So even if in a molecule there's the same number of carbons and hydrogens, these small little differences make them subtly different molecules. So like butene right here in panel C technically have the same molecular formula because the bonds are in different places, we'd have to add something to it or change the name. So 1-butene, there is a carbon bond there. 2-butene, the double bond is there. And then if it branches, so if it's a linear chain of carbons, or if one of the carbons branches off, then that's different. That's, going to be named a different kind of molecule. Even though it still has 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons in each one, the fact that it branches like this, it's a different place, makes it a different molecule. So yeah, there's all kinds of versatility that carbon can do. And then again, some things can be linear, but then they can actually form a ring. And the same thing with the rings. Even though it might have the same number of carbons, if there's a double bond, then that's a different molecule. Yeah. And so there are some molecules in biology called hydrocarbons. And if you look at the name, it probably, you can guess what's in there, a hydrogen and a carbon. So hydrocarbons are organic molecules made of only carbon and hydrogen. Many organic molecules like fats have hydrocarbon components. So this figure on the right is showing you, again, carbon in black and then hydrogens in the white spheres. And so this is a long molecule of just carbons and the attached hydrogens. Many organic molecules, again, like fats, have hydrocarbon components. And hydrocarbons can undergo reactions that release a large amount of energy. So, for example, that's why in our human fat cells, or adipose cells, our cells store fat. And a fat molecule is going to have regions of, hydrocarbons. They store a lot of energy, and so that's why our bodies store energy in these long chains of hydrocarbons. And then when we need energy down the line, we can break them down and get energy from that. Okay, more chemistry. I'm sorry about it. So isomers are compounds that have the same molecular formula, but different structures and properties. So kind of how I was pointing out, a couple of molecules that have the same number of carbons and number, somewhat related to that. So some compounds can have actually the exact same molecular formula, but different structures and properties. So structural isomers have different covalent arrangements of their atoms. So like where the bonds are. Cis-trans isomers have different shapes, and so they can also be called geometric isomers. They have the same covalent bonds, but differ in their spatial arrangements. And enantiomers are isomers that are mirror images of each other. So I'll show figures, in the next couple slides. I'm a very visual learner, visual person, and just our brain in general has so much dedicated to the visual aspects of sensory info, pictures. pictures, please. So isomers, there are structural isomers. So again, even though they may have the same number of carbons and hydrogens, if they're structurally different, then it's going to need a different name. So even though on the left there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hydrogens, and over here is the same, but because it's structurally different, it's called an isomer and a structural isomer. If something is a geometric isomer or a cis-trans isomer, it's basically the same, but there's a slight spatial difference. So see here on this, in panel B, there's 2 carbons double bonded, and then on the same side, there are 2 X's, and there's no element that's actually X. This is just standing in for any other chain or molecule or whatever. Anyway, so both of these are on the same side. So then it's called a cis isomer. If they happen to be on opposing sides, on opposite sides, then it's a trans isomer. So again, this molecule technically has all the same stuff, but because there's a small difference in what is on what side, then it's a cis-trans isomer. And then enantiomers are basically the same, but they're mirror images of each other. And so in chemistry, we can call one the L isomer and the other one the D isomer, based on, I don't even remember what. Again, that's a chemistry problem. But in enantiomer, they're mirror images of each other. And enantiomers are important in the pharmaceutical industry. So even if there's, again, it's this kind of the same molecule, but they are mirror images of each other, that can have really different effects. So 2 enantiomers of a drug can have different effects. Often only one of them is biologically active. And those differing effects of enantiomers help show that organisms are really sensitive to even like small variations in molecules. So for example, there is ibuprofen in this table. So ibuprofen has 2 enantiomers, 2 mirror images. One is the S ibuprofen, and then the other one is the R ibuprofen. And so in the case of ibuprofen, the S ibuprofen is what's actually effective. That enantiomer is able to be effective. And a second example is albuterol. So if somebody has asthma, my sisters have asthma, and sometimes they'll have to take albuterol. So in this case, the effective enantiomer is the R albuterol, and the S albuterol is the inactive form, the inactive enantiomer. So chemistry is really important, even if it is if you're going into a future field that's different and you think well, I'm going to be a doctor, what do I care about chemistry? It's important. It all does relate. Okay, and then almost lastly are chemical groups. So carbon is a big player and can form skeletons for different molecules that are important in biology, but there are also groups that are pretty common and are big players in biology and how molecules interact with each other. So the distinctive properties of organic molecules depend on the carbon skeleton and the chemical groups attached to it. It's all of this stuff that helps give each molecule its unique properties. So for example, of 2 biologically important molecules are estradiol and testosterone. These molecules look really similar, right? This picture at the bottom shows that. They both have 4 fused rings. So that's kind of their overall backbone is really similar, but they have 2 big differences. So these hormones differ only in the chemical groups attached to the rings. So in estradiol, here this is a hydroxide group, but over here this is a carboxyl group in testosterone. And then at this other position in testosterone, there is a methyl group, and then in estradiol, there's nothing here. And that leads to very different effects. These things are very structurally similar, but those tiny differences are going to have different, they behave differently and do different things. Yeah. So it's both the skeleton and those groups that are attached that are going to lead to different functions. So functional groups are the components of organic molecules that are most commonly involved in chemical reactions. They're like specific parts of a molecule that are going to interact a lot with other things. And each chemical group can be very different from each other. It's the number and arrangement of these functional groups that give each molecule unique properties. So here are some of the common chemical groups. A hydroxyl group is an O and an H. So oxygen and hydrogen. A carbonyl group has a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. A carboxyl group has both. So it has a carbonyl part where it's a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, but it also has a hydroxyl group bonded to that carbon. So that's a carboxyl group. An amino group has a nitrogen bonded to two hydrogens. A sulfahydryl group has a sulfur and a hydrogen. A phosphate group has a phosphate bonded to three or more oxygens. Well, I didn't like this. Well, yeah, okay, so it's 4 oxygens. Sorry. Oxygen, and then a phosphate, and then 3 other oxygens. And one of them is a double bond. And then lastly is a methyl group, which is just a carbon and then 3 hydrogens. And then there are words that you can apply to a molecule that has one of these groups. So if a molecule has a hydroxyl group, it's considered an alcohol, etc., etc. So luckily, again, for this class, you don't really have to worry too much about like memorizing these different carbon chemical groups. But it is just important to point out, you might hear about some of these things throughout the course, and it'll be helpful if you know, like, oh yeah, okay, amino group, I think I remember her saying it's a nitrogen and some hydrogens. But for this class, you won't have to like memorize them. If you do take biochemistry, if you are a bio major and you transfer and you take biochemistry, you will have to memorize these. And it is also a pain in the butt, but it's super interesting and super relevant. Yeah, biochemistry is super interesting and challenging, but interesting because it really is all relevant. So anyway, those are the functional groups that are kind of the most important and that you might see a lot in the course, are these different groups. So the main ideas from this lecture, or this part of the lecture, are that carbon atoms can form very diverse molecules because they can bond to 4 other atoms, and that there are a few chemical groups that are really important to molecular function. And that's it for lecture 2.